Well, thanks so much, Peter. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Now, I'm going to be speaking about the end of ESG. Now, you might think, well, this is heresy for a conference on ESG for me to give a talk with this title. But before you switch off your computers, why I'm giving a talk with this title is to highlight how hopefully in the future ESG will be so mainstream that we don't even need that term anymore. So there are certain things which are pigeonholed as being ESG issues, but if these are issues that matter for long-term value creation, then anybody in business, not just ESG professionals or ESG academics, should care about those factors. And the analogy is to Dick Thaler's famous 1999 article, The End of Behavioural Finance. And so what he stressed with that article is that behavioural finance should no longer be seen as a niche field, but everybody who wants to understand finance should make sure that they are taking into account human behaviour. So, what we have right now is not the end of ESG, but perhaps the peak of ESG. Right, every investor, every company, every academic, every business school is falling over themselves to show how much they are doing in terms of ESG. So we have now ESG metrics, and companies are forced to report on those metrics. Also, companies are asked to tie pay to ESG metrics, with some investors saying we're going to vote against your pay package if you don't do so. Irrespective of the level of pay, irrespective of the sensitivity to performance, what we care about is pay tied to ESG. We have special funds which sell themselves as being ESG funds. And we have ESG regulation like the SFDR within the European Union, which says if you are an ESG fund, you need to comply with these specific criteria, which we might not have for other types of funds. We have ESG engagement, where if you're an investor and you're engaging on a company's ESG factors, that's seen to be an even better type of engagement than engaging on profitability, on engaging on focus, capital allocation, and so forth. We also have this big debate between ESG believers and ESG deniers. What side are you on? Are you on our side or are you on their side? Are you with us or against us? And finally, we have this big existential question as if, does ESG work to begin with? And what I'd like to highlight is all of these discussions that we're having actually might be to the detriment of ESG because they are pigeonholing ESG into a narrow box. In fact, the issues that we're talking about are much broader and much wider than issues just for ESG believers and not for ESG deniers. So why? So one of the main reasons why we care about ESG is the argument that ESG factors are value relevant. They matter for the long-term sustainability of a business. So that is why we want to track ESG metrics. We want to make sure that a company is making progress on long-term value creation. That's why we want to make sure that funds are investing in ESG stocks, because if they're not, they might be investing in companies that go belly up. We want to engage on ESG factors, again, for the long-term value reasons and so forth. But if that is the main reason why ESG factors matter, they are no different from any other type of intangible asset. There's nothing special about ESG versus anything else that leads to long-term value. And indeed, my 2011 paper in the Journal of Financial Economics, which was one of the early papers to show that ESG factors matter for the long term, this looked at employee satisfaction. I actually titled the paper, Does the Stock Market Fully Value Intangibles? I positioned the paper as being about intangible assets. How many times did I mention ESG in the paper? Actually, not a single time. I never saw this as really an ESG paper. I saw this as being a paper about creating long-term value. Yes, it's true that the type of thing that creates long-term value is a stakeholder capital measure, employee well-being. But the reason why I looked at this was because it was something which was value relevant. And it's not just me. 30 years ago, in the Harvard Business Review, an influential article was published on the balanced scorecard. And what this highlighted is if you want to measure the value of a company, you have to look at not just tangible factors like profits and dividends and market share, but intangible factors. These might be things like customer satisfaction, net promoter score, employee attrition. Now, those things, you might not necessarily call them ESG factors, but that doesn't reduce their value. Nobody would disagree that something like Net Promoter Score or customer satisfaction was something that mattered. Now, the whole point of thinking about these things as ones that create long-term intangible value means that if we go to the topic of ESG metrics, actually, it should be just wider than just ESG. So there should be no special role for ESG metrics, let's say the number of the ethnic diversity or the waste or the carbon emissions that you're making, compared to other types of intangible measures like Net Promoter Score, like the number of new patents being generated, and so forth. If you go back to the balanced scorecard, what they highlighted was the importance of non-financial key performance indicators, or leading indicators. And a leading indicator is only a leading indicator if it leads to something. It is something which is value relevant. And so the key aspect of this is the ESG metrics, or intangible metrics that a company needs to report. They need to be really tailored to a company's business. For example, let's think about Olam. That's a Singaporean agribusiness. What they will measure is the number of smallholder farmers that they will put through their sustainable farming programs. That is highly value relevant because as an agribusiness, they really care about sustainable farming. But that's not something which is going to be relevant to, say, a bank. Let's take my bank, China's first digital bank. What will they measure? The number of new loans they give to entrepreneurs who never received a loan from any other bank before. Because for that, to them, that's an important leading indicator. They want to be reaching customers that other customers don't look at. And so when we have this increasing emphasis on ESG metrics, commonality, standardization, and so forth, yes, I'm somebody as a finance professor, I do understand the power of standardized data. But actually, what is value relevant for a business will differ from company to company. So when we stop thinking about the word ESG metrics, which has the idea of let this be standardized and common, and let's think about non-financial key performance indicators, leading indicators, can we give some flexibility to businesses to report what is relevant for them, even if it's not applicable to other companies? So certainly, there should be a lowest common denominator of measures that every company reports, but that should be a small subset. I think what is really relevant for the value of the business, that might be something which is tailored. My third bullet point is that when we're trying to look at gauging ESG or intangible value, many of these things will not be measures to begin with. So what you might care about are things like corporate culture, and that is far richer than looking at things like the gender pay gap or the CEO to worker pay ratio. And again, when we think about metrics, I think we're reducing this broad and really rich issue of what drives long-term value to a couple of boxes that can be ticked. And when we go back to the balanced scorecard, what Kaplan and Norton highlighted was that companies should report on these other measures, but they never said that pay should be tied to them. And what we have now with ESG metrics is this claim that, oh, if you really cared about ESG, you tie your pay to that. But clearly, we care about customer retention and employee attrition, but nobody would tie pay to those things. Why? Well, the idea is that if you're tying pay to long-term firm value, that will already be affected by anything which is value relevant. So you don't automatically additionally need to tie pay to ESG metrics anyway, because if the reason for caring about ESG is their value relevance, this will feed through to the long-term stock price. So the second thing that people really care about now is ESG funds. So if you're an ESG fund, it's seen that you should be put on a pedestal. You're a special type of fund, which is not just driving long-term value, but also making the world a better place. But that's not necessarily better than any other fund which is based on intangible assets. So one important intangible asset is the quality of a company's management. And if you had a fund which just really put a lot of emphasis in looking at the quality of the leadership, buying companies with great CEOs, shorting companies with poor CEOs, that wouldn't be seen as an ESG fund, but that has huge potential to create value because management quality is an intangible asset which might not be priced in. Now, we care about ESG funds not just for long-term returns, but for impact. But also for impact, wouldn't you like a fund to allocate capital to the inspirational CEOs and remove capital from the narcissistic CEOs? Again, I don't think there should be a particular pedestal for ESG versus any of these other intangible dimensions. Now, some people will say, well, greenwashing is a special issue for ESG funds. Do they do what they say? And so that's why we have special regulation. But isn't greenwashing an issue for any thematic fund? So the Parnassus Workplace Fund, which looks at companies with healthy workplaces, is there regulation which is trying to force them and make sure that they are genuinely looking at companies with good places to work. BlackRock Market Advantage, that is their regulation trying to force them to make sure that they're delivering a market advantage. Capital Group New World Fund, which looks at frontier markets, is their regulation to try and make sure that they're truly investing in the most innovative and forward-thinking new markets, or the Jupiter Global Financial Innovation Fund. You get the point here, but there's loads of funds with themes, and if we do care about greenwashing for ESG funds, we should care about greenwashing for any type of thematic fund. In fact, shouldn't we care about greenwashing for any fund? Because any fund whose prospectus aims to beat the market, and who doesn't beat the market, shouldn't they be in trouble with the regulator? Why is it that at the moment you will be in trouble if you claim to be an ESG fund but you hold some fossil fuel stocks? Yet, if you claim that you'll beat the market and you underperform 5 years in a row, nothing happens to you in terms of a regulator. Should we not hold funds accountable for things like that? But if you're an actively managed fund and you're trying to beat the market, and you're costing your savers lots of money, should that not be something that regulators also tackle? Why should this be limited to ESG? When we move to ESG engagement, this can add value. If you're improving ESG dimensions of a company which are value relevant, that can be fantastic for firm value. But why is that on a pedestal compared to other forms of engagement? Right, so if you're a shareholder and you don't support an ESG proposal, that seems to be something which is negative. But if you don't support something which may be, say, a demerge of the company which is going to unleash a lot of value, why is that not something that you should be held accountable for? And if we see ESG engagement as just another form of engagement, we know that engagement in general can subtract value as well as enhance value. So general engagement, there's this concern of short-termism. It may be that you're just focused on short-term profit. But similarly for ESG engagement, that could be quite short-termist. Right, there's ways of improving your ESG measures at the expense of long-term value. For example, yes, climate change is really, really important, but it's easy to cut your carbon emissions without thinking about a just transition, which is going to preserve as many jobs as possible. So just like engagement in general won't always add value, ESG engagement won't always add value. And so if you are an investor and you don't support certain ESG engagements, that should be fully legitimate. So recently Schroders decided not to support the living wage campaign against Sainsbury's, and it had very good reasons for doing so. It said there was many other ways to engage on the important aspect of worker welfare, but they were slammed, they were nixed by this. Some asset owners said, we're going to review whether we're going to invest with Schroders anymore. But that's surprising, right? For any type of engagement in general, it's not binary, it's nuanced, and we should see ESG engagement in the same way. My fourth point is the question of ESG believers versus deniers. And this is a point which has made me quite sad, to be honest, when I see this debate on how politicised, how, frankly, quite unprofessional the discussion has become. Because if we care about ESG, because it's value relevant or not, well, reasonable people can disagree as to whether something is value relevant. And we don't need to get in a big disagreement about it. We don't need to hate each other for it. We could just disagree as to what are the most important things for firm value. But for some reason, for ESG, this entitles people to actually be quite unprofessional about people who they disagree with. So this is a very leading practitioner in ESG who refers to the other side as just complete BS. His most recent article is cutting through the nonsense around ESG. But if people disagree with you, as to whether something adds long-term value, this is not necessarily nonsense, it's a different opinion. I've received messages like this. Hi Alex, you want to fight? Me and Aswath Damodaran are about to get in a boxing match about his ESG takedown piece. Please consider co-writing an op-ed with me. But my first instinct is not to fight. Aswath Damodaran is one of the leading teachers of finance in the world. If he believes that there's concerns about ESG, I would like to learn from them rather than initially fight with him. A more recent one from a senior managing director at one of the global investment banks. See The Economist special report this weekend. Why do you think these papers give the anti-ESG rhetoric oxygen? They fan flames of the deniers. But anti-ESG arguments are not rhetoric. They're just arguments. Just like for any factor which is value relevant, we can agree or disagree whether it adds value. And you're not necessarily a denier, but you just might have a different opinion. And now what I've done is I've taken statements from practitioners, but what does concern me is leading academics on this topic have also made even stronger statements, calling names to people on the other side. But as academics, what we want to do is encourage discourse. We might not agree with the other side, but to listen to them and give them the right to express their view, that's something we do with anything which is related to value. Just because this is ESG, rather than any other type of intangible value, does not give us an excuse to cancel the opposition. And finally, this debate on does ESG work? Well, if I consider ESG as being an intangible asset, then we think about the question, does investment in intangible assets pay off? Well, clearly the answer is not going to be yes or no, it's going to depend. Some types of investment work and sometimes don't. And so when we are to bring everything under one umbrella of ESG and make blanket statements as to whether it's good or bad, I think this is misleading. Some types of ESG work, sometimes don't. Just like for food. If we asked a question, is food good for you? That would be an irrelevant question. Yes, broccoli might be good for you, ice cream may not. But because ESG has become some kind of religion, it has to be we believe in everything or we believe in nothing, when actually the world has got lots of different shades of grey. So let me end my talk by thinking about, well, what are the implications? I've already talked about some implications for practitioners and policymakers. We might not just want to regulate ESG funds, but any fund that doesn't do what it says on its prospectus. But what are the implications for researchers in particular? Number one, I think researchers should be more granular, and that was my last point. Right, ESG combines many, many different factors, and it doesn't make sense to lump everything under this umbrella. And indeed, when I wrote my 2011 paper on employee satisfaction, I had to explain why I was looking at employee satisfaction and not the other ESG factors. Why? Because I wanted to address concerns of data mining. Why did I choose employee satisfaction? Because there was a strong hypothesis for why that would feed through to long-term returns. Other ESG factors like animal rights or Catholic values, there is not that same clarity in terms of hypothesis. But it now seems that we've gone in the opposite direction. If we write a paper which makes broad sweeping claims about ESG, then it's going to be more impactful than something which is focused. The second point is to be less monotonic. If we think about ESG as an intangible investment, like any investment, it has diminishing returns. Yet how we measure things as academics is that more is always better. We want higher ESG scores. We want investors that vote more against management. We want to tie pay to more ESG metrics. We want investors with longer holding periods, when in fact actually there might be some optimal medium here. It's not always more is better, but the way that we use these measures as academics does suggest that. We also should be less binary. So if we think about ESG factors as being valuation issues, then it should never be a black or white thing. So let's go to diversity. Right, if we think that diversity matters because diverse boards make better decisions, then if a company had a non-diverse board, that would never be a reason to exclude it. Right? It could be that we think the company should get a 10% valuation discount, but it may well be that even with that 10% valuation discount, we still want to invest in the company because the pricing is attractive or other intangible assets are also attractive. So when we're looking at, say, the profitability of strategies which are blanket exclusion, I don't think this is looking at what ESG should be about, which is additional intangible information to take into account, but should never be a yes-no thing. And that's also true if we don't just care about long-term value, but also about impact. I have a recent paper with two co-authors looking at if we, from a purely impact perspective, blanket exclusion is not as effective as underweighting a brown industry. The final implication is to expand the focus from quantitative measures. Yes, we're trying to look at ESG ratings and data and quantitative stuff, but the more quantitative something is, the more likely it's going to be priced in, and the less likely it's going to be relevant for long-term shareholder returns. So why I chose to look at employee satisfaction was that was an intangible measure, and therefore I thought the stock market would not value it, which is why my title was, Does the Stock Market Fully Value Intangibles? Now let me just end with one caveat, which is, throughout my talk, I focused on the value relevance of ESG. We care about ESG because it affects long-term value. But you might think, haven't I just been really narrow? Don't we care about ESG because of the externalities? We don't just care about our long-term returns, we care about the impact on wider society. And I have a lot of time for that. But notice that many other intangibles also have impacts on wider society. So Kodak had sleepy management, which was not innovative. And that led to Kodak going bankrupt, 150,000 employees lost their jobs, and a lot of investors lost their money. Google has been highly innovative, creating positive externalities. Where would our lives be without Google Search and Google Maps? But because those are not necessarily ESG factors, they don't get this special halo. So yes, we care about externalities, and ESG does provide externalities, but so do other things, like great management, like great innovation. Let's widen the discussion. And if ESG is pursued for externality reasons, we need an argument for why the government is not best placed to address those externalities. And there are good reasons. Maybe the government can't measure certain things. And we also need to make sure there's a way of canvassing shareholders to make sure that they do care about the externalities that a company is pursuing. Otherwise, it might just be the whims of the CEO, and then she's not accountable. So let me conclude. So why I'm calling this the end of ESG is what I'm trying to highlight is ESG is about long-term value-relevant intangible assets. Yes, some of them might be what we see as ESG factors, but other things like great leadership, great management, great innovation are things what matter as well. Now, the new book, Principles of Corporate Finance, which has been a major textbook for decades, is now out. I'm proud to be a co-author of that. And I would love to say I've completely overturned 40 years of textbook work by putting in this ESG component. But I haven't, because many of the principles of standard finance do apply to ESG. You learn in Finance 101 that net present value is the present value of all future cash flows. So ESG matters because it affects long-term cash flows, and therefore we should not think about the term ESG anymore, or the factors that we're thinking about, such as employee satisfaction, such as diversity and inclusion, such as environmental record. They are all things that matter because they affect long-term value. They are not just ESG factors, they are value-relevant intangible assets. Thank you very much for your attention.